Sometimes when you scratch the surface of a subject, the true meaning is far deeper than what first appears. I discovered that while reading Horse. Horse is a poem that describes a horse running towards some American boys in hopes of being fed corn, but instead gets tied up and hurt by the boys. The Mexicans who saw this incident happen knew that the boys would not get in trouble, so they just sat there and said nothing, even though they knew what the boys were doing was wrong. After the horse was almost dead, the owner came and put the horse out of its misery. Later, the American father came to pay the owner for the horse, but the owner turned the money away. Even though the boys never got in trouble for what they did, they felt bad for what they had done in the end. When you first read the poem, it seems that it is only talking about children hurting a horse because it's running towards them. The poem's theme is so much more bigger than that. When I finally sat down and analyzed the poem, it seemed like it was saying the Americans in this poem take things for granted and do not think about things they do because they feel they can get away with anything just as long as they have money to make up for their actions. Although I believe the theme of Horse is centered around the actions of the Americans in this poem, the speaker spent majority of the poem talking about the horse, by how the writer started off talking about the horse itself and then went on to vividly describing what the kids put the horse through, made me first think that this poem was just about the killing of a horse. There is a lot of repetition in the poem pertaining to the horse, such as the idea of a horse running in the fields towards some hands and the word red when making a reference to the horse bleeding on the ground. I think Gloria went into so much detail about the horse so that the reader would have to pull out the true meaning of the poem. It seems that the true meaning was camouflaged in order to force the reader to take a second look and think more carefully about the poem. When I took a second look, I started picking away at the hidden message of Horse, which is that the Americans did not care about the horse and thought the horse and their actions were easily forgettable and replaceable with money. In the poem, it has the Mexicans describing how the kids tortured the horse and why they went unpunished. They said, but they're gringos and the sheriff won't do a thing. He'll just say boys will be boys, just following their instincts. Although the speaker makes it clear that the boys are doing something that is bad, it's acceptable and their actions go unpunished because they are American or gringos. Later, the Mexicans go on to say, but it's the mind that kills the animal. Here, the speaker is trying to tell us that the Americans have a mindset that is ignorant and they do not know any better. Their ignorance and selfishness is what really killed the horse. They were selfish by terrorizing someone else's horse for their own enjoyment, when the horse probably had a more purposeful use in mind other than being tormented. The Mexicans saw that the horse was valuable, but the Americans didn't because they took the horse's well-being for granted and thought they could pay off what they had done to the horse. This is evident when the poem reads, the Chicanos shake their heads, turn away some rich father, fished out his wallet, held out folds of green as if green could starch red. The Mexicans clearly showed their disapproval by shaking their heads. They also were trying to let the American father know that the death of a horse could not be bought by turning him away along with the money. The Americans' actions demonstrated that they thought their actions were justifiable just as long as they had money to pay off their horrible actions. Even though at the end of the poem, the American boys realized what they did was wrong, they never said they were sorry nor took responsibility for their actions. Their father just simply thought that he could pay the owner for the dead horse and the boys' behavior would be excused. The Mexicans also thought the boys' behavior was permissible because they were American, and the Mexicans in the poem thought the American boys did not think or care about what they had done until they had done the action. Again, this is shown when the Mexicans say, but it's the mind that kills the animal. This quote is referring to the selfish and inconsiderate qualities in the Americans. Although Gloria is not glorifying the Mexicans, the speaker is somewhat saying the Mexicans behave better than the Americans. When the speaker said, the Mexicanos mumble, if you're Mexican, you are born old. Being born old does not literally mean an old person was born again. This quote is actually trying to say that the Mexicans are born with wisdom that old people have. This wisdom is shown when the Mexicans mumble amongst themselves about what the boys were doing instead of joining them because they were wise enough to know that the American boys were doing something wrong. The poem did not say that Americans were born old, but instead showed how they tortured the horse and thought they could use money to make things better. Throughout the poem, but especially here, I saw that there was a big difference in the way Americans and Mexicans acted in the poem. Horse showed the American boys taking the life of a horse for granted by killing the horse for no reason. The poem also showed the American dad taking the horse for granted by trying to replace the horse's life with money. Although the Americans in this poem do not seem like good people, all Americans do not act this way. You cannot generalize a whole culture because of what a couple of people did from that particular culture. And that's exactly what the Mexicans in this poem did by saying, but they're gringos, while the boys were killing the horse. If the American boys did an unacceptable act, then something should have been said instead of letting them off because they were from a certain culture. Due to the boys being gringos, it is assumed that they do not know any better. Since the Mexicans just sat back and let the boys keep hurting the horse, they were only feeding the boys ignorance. If you want someone to do better, then you have to show them. Although you cannot change a whole culture, you can influence someone from that culture.